Up next on Book TV, Afterwards, with guest host Juan Williams, columnist for The Hill. This week, syndicated columnist Cal Thomas and his latest book, What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America. In it, he argues that solving the country's problems start with looking at what worked in the past, discarding politics, and listening to voters. This program is about an hour.
We're joined by Cal Thomas. His new book, What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America, forward by Sean Hannity. That tells you a lot about this book, Cal.
Well, Sean's a very good friend, of course, and HarperCollins Zondervan, which is publishing the book, thought that he would be a very good person to have write the foreword. I was happy he did so. Nancy Pelosi was not available, so I was glad to have his foreword. He did a good job.
So this is intended for a conservative audience?
Well, not necessarily, because I think solving the problems in America are not liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. We have serious challenges facing us, Juan, that affects everybody, regardless of their political background or persuasion.
But if you have Sean Hannity, well, I mean, it seems to me that Sean is a quite popular figure among hardline conservatives.
Well, sure he is. But, right. You know, we try to reach out in this book, and naturally, I believe conservative ideas provide the best solutions to the problems facing America. But as I say in the book, if a liberal comes up with an idea that actually works and proves itself and lives up to its stated objectives, I'm for it. I'm for Social Security. I'm for Medicare and all these programs that were created mostly in liberal Democrat administrations. But I just want to take a look at them to see if they need to be updated for a modern age and improved. If they're not working, then we need to revise them or get rid of them.
Well, in fact, the thesis of this book, and I'm going to come back to that idea of thesis because it's one you play with in the book, but the idea of this book is what works, what actually works, and what do we know has worked in the past, common sense solutions that come from the past, and in some sense come not only from the political realm, but for you, from your deep faith.
Yes, well, there's a verse in Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament that says there's nothing new under the sun. Everything you think has been thought before. Everything you do has been done before. So I'm not talking about living in the past. I'm talking about looking to the past to see what has worked, updating it as necessary, and moving forward. If you go to another country for the first time, you usually get a guidebook or Google Paris, France or something to find out where the best hotels are, the best restaurants, places to be avoided. These are people who've gone before us to scope out these cities and to recommend the best places for us. We have the founders of our country who understood human nature at least as well as the preachers of their day. And they created a constitution that established boundaries for government, but unlimited liberty for its citizens. I believe that has gotten out of whack, and we've exceeded those boundaries, those constitutional boundaries, and that's why we have so many of the problems and challenges that we have today.
Now, in previous books, you had to remind readers that you weren't saying disengage from public life in the public square, but people might get that perception given your emphasis on simply focus on the individual capacity and individual responsibility. Look away from government. Don't look to government to meet your needs. Look to the individual and look to God.
Yes, well, I think that's where it all begins. And the founders certainly saw power delegated from the people to the government, not government overpowering us. And that's why government has grown so big and dysfunctional. I don't think there's anybody, including the biggest liberal, who thinks that everything is working well and we ought to just keep pouring more money into it and growing government ever bigger. Thomas Sowell, the great writer and a friend, has written, I got this little card, I carry it around like Bob Dole carries the 10th Amendment in his pocket. He says, much of the social history of the Western world over the past 3 decades has involved replacing what worked with what sounded good. Now, our friend Bob Beckel, who's on the 5 on Fox, and I co-wrote this book and do a column for USA Today called Common Ground, acknowledges that many of the social programs were begun in good faith in the Lyndon Johnson administration, the so-called Great Society. But he acknowledges now that we didn't take into consideration human nature, that giving people a check, that providing women with checks when they have babies out of wedlock was not only not good for them, it wasn't good for the country. We moved a long way from John Kennedy's great inaugural admonition, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
So you believe, though, people should remain engaged with government and with politics?
Oh, sure, absolutely, or I wouldn't be writing my syndicated column for the last 30 years. But I'm saying, Juan, that you shouldn't expect more out of government than it can deliver, and less out of yourself than you can deliver. Things like character and virtue and integrity cannot be instilled by government. Those are moral and spiritual issues. Like table manners, you have to be taught not to interrupt adults at the table. When I was growing up, not to mix your peas with your mashed potatoes, to eat them with a knife because it might have been easier, or a spoon. You have to be taught certain things. These manners, conducting yourself with adults if you're a child, these are all things that have to be taught. And I think personal responsibility and integrity, looking out for yourself, looking to government as a last resort, not a first resource, is what will improve any life and improve our country.
But somehow I get the impression that you think liberals are people who, in fact, would be overly reliant on government and don't have some of these virtues that you just described, you know, personal responsibility, wanting to work, wanting to succeed in America, wanting to contribute. Is that right?
Well, no, I know many liberals, including yourself, if you so self-identify, who have these character qualities. But the problem is, so many of my liberal friends, even though they may have those character qualities, look to government to repair what is wrong with people who don't have those character qualities. We know what the problems are. A stable family is the best guarantee of a stable home and of people being able to take care of themselves. We know this. Judith Wallerstein, who I quote in the book, the late sociologist, did a study of the effects of divorce on children. She studied them for 25 years. We know that divorce harms children, many of them. Oh, yes, some people survive, but many of them don't. So these are some of the things that I explore in the book. And again, if it's a liberal idea and it works, it promotes the general welfare, then I'm for it. I don't think we ought to say just because it's a liberal or conservative idea, we shouldn't pay attention to it.
But, you know, in the book, you write, Cal, you say President Obama, and I think you would describe him as a liberal.
Yeah, no question.
Okay. You say that he took advantage of the human instinct for envy and greed in order to get elected.
Yeah, I think the unholy trinity is envy, greed, and entitlement. And I think we see that in his constant statements about income inequality, his running down of large corporations and businesses who employ an awful lot of people who themselves pay an awful lot of taxes instead of building people up. Calvin Coolidge once said, "You don't improve the weak by tearing down the strong." I want more people to be rich. I want more people to be independent. I want more families to be stable. All of these things I'm for, and who could be against that? But the president is out there, and a lot of Democrats, frankly, are out there constantly bashing success, penalizing success, subsidizing failure, and what you penalize you get less of, and what you subsidize you get more of.
You know, it's interesting. You have a background having worked for the moral majority, Jerry Falwell.
Yeah, 5 years.
And then in this book, you talk about Joshua Du Bois, who was at the White House as the president's kind of spiritual advisor, but also head of the Office of Faith and Public Service. I might be misquoting the exact title. He has written a book, and he talks about how the president reads daily meditations and scripture, and talks about other people in the city, Washington, D.C., in the federal government, who do the same.
Yes.
But you say Du Bois is off when he comes to his message, because what he talks about is the idea that government should care for people who are in need as opposed to individuals. And you make it seem as if he's saying, well, God wants us to have compassion, and therefore Du Bois, Obama, and the liberals think, oh, that means government should be compassionate. And you're saying no. You're saying... I'm saying
the government, again, ought to be a last resort, not a first resource. Government can become addictive like a drug. You come to rely on a government check rather than yourself. In Britain, where I spend a lot of time in the UK, I go 3 or 4 times a year, the Daily Mail did a story a few months ago on a family, 3 generations of people who had never worked, who had been on their version of welfare, public assistance. Not only had they never worked, they didn't expect to have a job, and when they were told by David Cameron's administration that they should start looking for work, they were offended. Now, that's the kind of addiction that, not in everybody, but in too many people, that government brings. And so, I don't question the president's faith. That's not my business. But I do think that in certain areas there ought to be a connection, if he reads the scriptures every day, about human life, about marriage. You can disagree and be a Christian on taxes and the defense budget and still not be in danger of going to hell. But I think there are certain basic things that if you are a serious believer, an Orthodox Jew, a serious Christian, that Scripture teaches that ought to carry over into your public policy. Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York, had this speech a number of years ago at Notre Dame. And he caught himself in a trap where he said, well, I accept my church's teaching when it comes to the death penalty for convicted murderers, but he doesn't accept it when it comes to abortion for the innocent unborn. I find that to be an incredible inconsistency.
Well, of course, many people on the right are for the death penalty,
yes,
even as they oppose abortion. So they, too, are caught in this trap.
Sometimes, but I think the difference is that when you have a convicted murderer, somebody who's taken the life of another person, that's a whole lot different morally from an innocent unborn child who's never had a chance to take a breath of life, much less to do anything illegal.
I think this conversation could go on because, I mean, I'm sure that the Planned Parenthood people, if they were president, would talk about the life of the living woman and being important. But let me just ask you, going back to President Obama as, let's say, the quintessential or prototype of the liberal in your book, your point is that while the government can be compassionate, that you really don't want it to be compassionate. You want to focus on what works. And therefore, you're talking about individuals having a responsibility, or I guess a sort of, if they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever their belief, having a sense that they should be compassionate, but it's up to the individual, not up to government to take care of the poor.
Well, look, let me go back to another book written in the early 80s that Newt Gingrich, when he was Speaker of the House, handed out to everybody in Congress, as I recall. It was called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and it was written by Marvin Olasky. He went back again in history and looked at the major religious institutions, the Jewish, the Christian groups, who cared for the poor as a first responsibility. But in their caring for the poor, they required some kind of a response. In other words, if you were poor because you were a drug addict or an alcoholic, you had to enter a program to get rid of your addiction, and then we're going to help you. But we're not going to sustain you in your bad lifestyle choices. If you were having constantly babies out of wedlock with no husband, no father in the home, we're not going to send you a check to continue to do that. We're going to help you with those kids because it wasn't their fault, but we're not going to allow you to continue to have kids out of wedlock and send you a check. And the whole point of the Jewish and the Christian institutions at the time was to reform these people so they would lead a better life that would be better in the end for themselves. Now, they have been replaced, they've retreated to the sidelines by government. And it's become what I call a perversion of the 23rd Psalm. The government is my keeper, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of poverty, the Health and Human Services Department is there comforting me with the EBT cards.
So, it's interesting, though, in looking at this, you talk about the expansion of the entitlement society, as you describe it, something that is a Republican refrain. But then I think to myself as I'm reading, there's no reference to the fact that we went through this horrible recession. Really, people now call it the Great Recession, in reference to the Great Depression. And as a consequence of that, not only has there been more reliance on the public safety net, including entitlements, but we've done things like bail out the rich.
Yeah, I agree with that, Juan. I'm all for a safety net. What I'm against is a hammock. Nancy Pelosi said that if you give us the power, the Democrats the power back again, we're going to drain the swamp. Okay, they got the power back, and instead she built a hot tub. I don't think government is a first resource. You take a look at the recession. What was the primary reason for the recession? Government was spending too much. It allowed big companies like GM and others, because of the union pressure, to ratchet up the benefits and entitlements that they had no hope in paying because of what the union pressure and the threats of strikes. And so when you got to a point where GM, let's take one example, could no longer afford, based on how many cars they were selling, to pay out these benefits, a crisis ensued. The same with the Treasury Department. Print more money, print more money, print more money. Never come to the point where you tell people, We can't do this anymore. It's like the college student who goes off to college and he or she is on a budget, and they blow it in a wild living in the first weekend there at fraternity parties or sorority parties, and call mom and dad with a hangover on Monday and say, hey, I'm all out of money, send more. Well, if you do, you're a fool, because you're indulging the behavior that is not really in their best interests. And that's what our federal government has done for too many years.
Well, you know, I don't think that's right, Cal. I think that, as I understand the cause of the Great Recession, it was, in fact, that we had a housing bubble, and the housing bubble broke. And secondly, that people on Wall Street were engaging in high-risk maneuvers, investment instruments, that proved to be faulty and collapsed and caused Wall Street to implode.
I agree with both of that, but let's take Fannie and Freddie just as an example, since you brought that up. Why did the housing bubble occur, and why did it explode? It's because presidents over several administrations of both parties wanted to be able to get up and say, under my administration, more people own their own homes than ever before. That is a very worthy goal. But if you're handing out money to people with bad credit and who have income levels that cannot sustain after these balloon mortgages after 7 years come up and reset, and they can't afford it, that's the problem. And too many people came to expect that they should be able to live in a nice big house when they didn't have the income to sustain it. So part of this is a political problem, and part of it is a moral problem, and part of it is an economic problem. And those three things, and you're right about Wall Street as well, you're absolutely right. Anybody saw that HBO film, and I can't remember the name of it now, that portrayed all of this, everybody was living beyond their means. Everybody was greedy. Everybody wanted to make more and more money, and everybody was willing to cut whatever corners in order to do so. So, yes, this isn't just a left-right Republican-Democrat thing. As they used to say in World War II, we're all in this together, and we all have a certain amount of culpability for what happened.
But the narrative that you presented was initially all about government overspending, individuals making bad decisions, and in fact what you see if you look at the housing market, the housing industry, and what happened there, and you look at what we know happened on Wall Street, it seems to me that you have a lot of very wealthy people and people who were acting as lone wolves, individuals. I'm out for myself. I'll give to charity, but I'm going to make a lot of money. A lot of that very self-obsessed behavior hurt the country.
Well, it hurt the country because the government bailed out AIG and some of these other. But I would have let them collapse. See, this is one of the problems, Juan. It's not just indulging and subsidizing the poor. It's indulging and subsidizing the rich.
But I don't see that in this book.
Well, look, I only had so many pages, and the editor took out a lot of stuff. Okay. But I say this in my columns, and I said it during the AIG failure and the business under the Bush administration. In the last interview, one of the last interviews that President George W. Bush did with me before he left office, he said, "Well, at least I stuck to my principles." And I said, "Well, what about bailing out AIG? And how's that sticking to your principles? All this government money?" And he said, "Well, what would you have done?" I said, "I would have stuck with my principles. A failure is a great teacher. I've failed at things. I've learned a lot from failing. I've been fired. One time I had to go down to the unemployment office back when it was only 26 weeks and not 99 weeks as it is now for a couple of weeks to get an unemployment check. But failure is a great teacher for those who will learn from it. And the best thing that could have happened to Wall Street, the best thing that could have happened to GM, in my view, is for them to have failed and to restructure under the bankruptcy law to reestablish themselves, not get a government handout."
But you understand that when Wall Street implodes, you're impacting pensions,
sure, me
401ks, the entire financial structure of America
but not
would have been cratered.
Well,
you understand that people in the Congress, that the Bush administration, good Republicans, as well as the Obama administration, were told, we're all in a financial calamity. We as an American people have to come together to resolve it.
Juan, here's one of the problems and why things don't work in Washington. On the left, you've got the trial lawyers and the other groups that send lots of money to Democratic politicians. On the right, the Republicans, you've got Wall Street, you've got big corporations who send a lot of money to politicians. And when the objective is to only get reelected, as it so often is with something like a 90-some% reelection rate in this town, when that is the objective, instead of doing the business of the people, you're going to have dysfunctional, non-working government. So I become a political environmentalist, Juan. I believe in recycling trash and politicians for the same reason, because each left in one place too long begins to emit a foul smell. There's a disease in this town. You come here with the highest motives and the best ethics, and it doesn't take very long for you to get corrupted. Get them out before they catch it.
Well, I think most Americans agree with you, and the polls indicate that. There was a Wall Street Journal poll recently said I think it was 54% of Americans say throw all the bums out. But
fine,
you know,
well, don't reelect them.
But
then.
that's not the reality.
That's not the reality.
That's not the reality. Right. But you do speak about term limits in this book, What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America. And when it comes to kind of the basis of the financial structure, the government, taxes, what you say is what has worked is always low taxes because, according to Cal Thomas, the gospel according to Cal, what happens is that if you lower taxes, it results in more receipts for the government. In fact, the government gets more money. But what about the contrary point, which would be that, well, gee, you know what? Taxes are pretty low right now under the Obama administration. Taxes were low under Clinton administration. Taxes were low under the Bush administration
and the Reagan administration.
So I mean,
well, it's a combination. It's not just the taxes. It's the spending. That's what has got us out of whack here. So you got, even when the Republicans are in office, even when they hold all three branches of government, Juan, the spending continues to increase. Maybe a little less than when the Democrats are in office. But let's go back to Woodrow Wilson at World War I, okay? Right after World War I, the taxes were finally cut. And we had the Roaring '20s. Okay, there were other problems that led to the Great Depression. I understand that. Yes, of course. But coming out of that, we get to 1960 and John Kennedy and his famous Detroit Economic Club speech about cutting taxes. There was a rush of new revenue because people were taking their money out of safe havens and bringing it back into the marketplace. As I say in the book, we have trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines now. Yes, the stock market is at an all-time high, but unemployment, especially for the hardcore unemployed and those who've been looking for jobs for many months, continue to be without work. People who want work. Now, we saw a slight uptick on the unemployment rate because more people are starting to look for work again. They have a slightly increased level of optimism. But again, Calvin Coolidge, I want people to be taxed less so they have more. And when you and I have more money to spend, we are going to spend it or invest it. And that's what creates the jobs. Reagan knew this. Bush 43 knew this. Even Bill Clinton, who went down to speak to a group of Houston businessmen right after a tax increase that he helped push through Congress, said, you probably think I raised your taxes too much. Well, so do I. Well, there's a case of having it both ways, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, you know what's interesting in listening to this, though, obviously, you remember that under Clinton, we actually had not only the same tax rates we have now, in fact, they were a little higher, right? But we had a surplus.
We had the surplus because the Democrats, led by the president, were cutting defense and cutting spending on some of what most people would agree, particularly in the age of terrorism, and now the rise of China and Iran's nuclear program. Even the president now has announced he wants to cut the military more. Putin, others are getting this message that the United States doesn't have the will, much less the wherewithal, to stand against tyrants around the world. So Clinton cut the defense budget. And again, when you cut spending and you maintain a certain level of revenue, yeah, you're going to get a balanced budget and probably a surplus. And that's what's happening in the States, Juan. I've got a whole chapter in the book on what's happening in the States. We have Indiana, we have Louisiana, we have Georgia, we have a lot of states out there who are doing fantastic jobs, many of them balanced budgets. Yes, their state constitutions require them. That's a good thing. I wish we could have that in the federal level. But also because of their policies. In Indiana, the star state, in my view, of the country, they send people checks when they have enough money. This is an amazing thing to me. They say, well, we don't need all this money. The federal government, of course, the word goes out at the end of the fiscal year. If you haven't spent it all because, you know, your budget might be cut next year. But in Indiana, they send you a check. What a remarkable thing.
Well, that brings us to another topic that you address in What Works, Common Sense Solutions, which is big government. And you quote Rush Limbaugh extensively with regard to big government is terrible, and then you go to the Federalist Papers and all the rest. But then you have to somehow explain to me, well, then how is it that you can say, well, but Social Security, Medicare, these things that our seniors rely on, that's a good thing. Clearly, you're a big fan of defense spending, and that's, of course, Guess what? I mean, the founding fathers were not about international use of our military overseas. That they didn't want any part of that.
Thomas Jefferson would find that difficult. I mean, he sent Marines to the Barbary Coast, and
eventually, but their initial precept was, we have nothing to do with
Well, they lived in a different age then. Of course, there's still a strain of that in the country today. But let's talk about defense. This may surprise you. Bob Beckel and I agree on this. There are a lot of weapon systems and planes and ships that the military have said they don't want and don't need. And yet, because those things are built in the district of Congressman so-and-so, they get built anyway because it makes him or her look good, creates more jobs, this is the kind of wasteful spending I'm talking about. And it's both left and right, Republican and Democrat. They're both culpable on this. I think what we need, Juan, is something akin to the Grace Commission during the Reagan administration, or the BRAC Commission, the Base Realignment and Closing Commission, during, I think, the Clinton administration. An outside group with integrity, former members of Congress, no current elected politicians, to come in and do a complete audit of government from top to bottom. Every agency of government, Juan, has a piece of legislation or a charter that created it. It has a purpose. If it's not fulfilling that purpose or not doing it within a reasonable budget, it should be cut or eliminated. Let's just take Head Start. I mean, this came in with the highest motivation. Do you know, and I didn't until I researched it, there are now 3 Head Starts. There's Early Head Start, there's Enhanced Head Start, and there's Regular Head Start. Why did we have the other 2? Because the first one wasn't working. Why did we have the third one? Because the second one wasn't working. Dr. Mulhausen of Heritage Foundation has done a tremendous book on this, on American social programs that don't work. He has found that by the time a child who goes through one of these Head Start programs is in the 5th grade, all of the benefits that might have accrued in the first few years of his or her life are gone. USA Today had a recent lead editorial which said Head Start at best is mediocre. So what I'm saying is, if it doesn't work, or if it's something like Social Security, which was never intended to be the kind of program it is today, it was intended to be a safety net, an insurance program, but we've added all of these bells and whistles onto it, a huge Christmas tree, to mix a metaphor, and this is why it's become dysfunctional and going broke. Same with Medicare. The initial idea was a good one, but politicians always add stuff on and it becomes dysfunctional.
Now, this brings us then to one of the interesting chapters in the book about education. Because basically you're saying, they're always talking about these people who know too little, who rely on religion, evangelicals, do-nothing, know-nothing voters and the like. And Cal Thomas comes out in What Works and says, well, why do you send kids off to these big-name schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the Ivy League, Stanford, and the like? You say smart parents, even if they're called do-nothing, shouldn't be sending their kids to those schools.
Well, let's take a look at this recent debate that is now going on and continuing between Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York and the New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio over charter schools. Now, we know that during his campaign for mayor, Mayor de Blasio said that he was going to basically end charter schools, and he has this major rivalry with this woman named Moskowitz in New York, who is a big proponent of them. Now, Andrew Cuomo, in a speech a few days ago, was a remarkable speech. If you had shown me the words and didn't tell me who said it, I would have said it would have been delivered by a conservative Republican. He said we spend more money in New York State per capita than anywhere else in the country on public education. And yet he said we're number 32 in the nation in terms of achievement in math and reading and other essentials that everybody would agree are absolutely required to make anything out of your life. So he's saying we got to have this school choice in this area. So what I'm saying in the book, and I'm going beyond the universities, is that some of my liberal friends who are for choice on abortion are against choice when it comes to public schools, and especially for poor and minority children. We have a reversal of George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door to keep African Americans out more than 50 years ago. We now have people standing in the schoolhouse door, the poor schools, to keep children in, when we all know that a good education is a ticket to a child's success, and competition, whether it's package delivery or restaurants, improves everyone. And so all I'm saying is, let's have choice in education. Let's let parents decide which school, public, private, religious, is best for their kid. And let's also tell parents, if you don't want your kids to have their faith and the real history of this country undermined, don't send them to colleges and universities, that do that.
Oh, that's why you're saying don't send your kids to the best colleges in America.
Well, best is a relative term.
Well, best colleges in terms of the competitive marketplace where you see people with money and advantage send their children. They send them to Stanford. They send them to Harvard. But you're saying here, don't send them because you believe, and I think you came to it at the end of what you just said, those schools challenge some of the precepts of religious faith?
Well, not just religious faith, but the history of our own country. I just heard on one of the talk radio stations recently about this woman called in, and her public school child is getting some kind of indoctrination about the Pilgrims and the early colonists. That somehow the Native Americans were bucolic people who were at peace with themselves and each other, and these horrible white Europeans invaded and gave them syphilis and gonorrhea and stole their corn and killed them off and all of this other stuff. And this is the kind of stuff that is being taught increasingly in a government school system. Most parents don't hear about it. It's not always in the textbooks, although it is in some. I think that we are living in an education model that was created in the 19th century. I'm all for diversity. This was supposed to be the great melting pot. You were going to have people of different backgrounds, religions, race, and all of that come into a central unit and be taught something. And I'm not opposed to that idea. I think it's a very good thing. However, what are they being taught? And if it violates the faith and the values and the beliefs of a significant number of people who are paying through their taxes for this, they ought to be able to have the choice of sending their child to another school, public, private, religious, that more reflects those views. And I believe that's going to improve the public schools because, like anything else, when you have competition...
Just for a second before we go to break, let's just take a moment here and say, you mean challenging orthodoxies is bad in your view? Well, and having those children learn how to think critically?
Oh, I think you learn to think critically. I mean, I'm out thinking critically all the time. I'm exposed to all kinds of ideas, not only in the newspapers for which I write, but the television on which I appear and billboards that I see all the time. So, but look, when you have a child, you have to train them up properly. You have to get them to the point where they can make critical decisions. You have to have a certain foundation of belief and purpose for living. And am I just here to get an education to make money, to buy stuff? Is that going to make me happy? Or do I need a spiritual and moral dimension to buttress that? And I think that's what's missing in a lot of our government schools.
Harvard is not a government school.
Well, no, but we're talking about two different things here. I'm talking about the public schools.
Well, no, but you were talking in the book about don't send your kids to Harvard or Princeton or Stanford.
Harvard, Dartmouth, Yale, and Princeton were all founded on biblical principles, some of them to train preachers, some of them to train missionaries. You go there now, all of that's gone. I don't remember, but I remember him saying it. I'm not old enough. Nathan Pusey, when he was president of Harvard more than a century ago, said the least that should be expected of a Harvard graduate is that he learned to pronounce the name of God without embarrassment. Right. Now in too many of these schools, God has become the embarrassment.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Cal Thomas, his new book, What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America.
On the Go, Afterwards is available via podcast through iTunes and XML. Visit booktv.org and click Podcasts on the upper left side of the page. Select which podcast you'd like to download and listen to Afterwards while you travel.
We're back with Cal Thomas. He's the author of a new book called What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America. Cal, at the end of your book, you write, let's have, I'm quoting here, the equivalent of testimony time in church where we can start showcasing people who once lived in poverty and despair, now self-sufficient because they embrace the conservative and historically sound principles of Kansas. Inspiration followed by motivation. Well, first explain Kansas.
Well, I made a speech which is reproduced in the book to the Kansas Chamber of Commerce 18 months or so ago, and I think Sam Brownback, who former United States Senator from Kansas, now governor of the state, has created some tremendous business-friendly programs there that are increasing employment and lowering taxes, and Kansas is even talking about eliminating state income taxes. A number of states are doing that. Louisiana is another talking about it. I think, I forget the exact number, I think 7 or 8 states now do not have a state income tax, when years ago it was only 2, I think North Carolina and Florida. They still don't. Many are realizing that this becomes an inhibitor to prosperity. Now, I do say, I firmly believe, and I've applied it in my own life, inspiration followed by motivation, and you left out one, followed by perspiration, improves any life. The whole metaphor of testimony time in church is meant to convey the attitude, I once was blind, but now I see. I grew up poor, but now I'm a CEO. Take Ben Carson, who's been in the Dr. Ben Carson, who's been in the news a lot lately, the former chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. A perfect example of how people can overcome dire circumstances. Grew up in inner city Detroit at a horrible time, single mother, raised he and his brother, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, most people know the story. They can look it up. We don't tell those kinds of stories in America. America's a storytelling nation.
Well, in fact, in the book, what you do is you have an entire section of people who would give this testimonial, and you tell their stories. So rather than have me pick out one or two, why don't you, as the author, pick out one or two and tell the stories?
Well, I talked about Ben Carson. There are Johnny Erickson Tata, who is a quadriplegic, who had an accident when she was 17 years old swimming, and struggled a lot with despair and the meaning of life. Taught herself to paint by sticking a paintbrush in her teeth, and has created a lot of wonderful things. Worked with handicapped people, was behind Push Strongly, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and has been an inspiration to millions, including people who do not have physical challenges. There are a couple of African people in there who grew up in horrible circumstances that you couldn't even imagine if you were writing a work of fiction. And yet they managed to overcome, and they managed to come to America where they sought opportunity, and now they're independent and prospering. Again, Ben Carson is a great story, but the point of these stories, and Paul Harvey used to do them, the late Paul Harvey on his radio program called The Rest of the Story. You would say, okay, if you think you have a hard life and difficulty, let me tell you about somebody else and how they overcame. We're not just going to tell the story, we're going to tell you how they overcame. We're not just going to sing the song, we're going to tell you. And I go back and I tell the story of 60 Minutes. Leslie Stahl did this piece some years ago in a Harlem housing project in New York. This was all minorities, led by a minority, hardcore unemployed people who have either never had a job or they were only hamburger flippers working for minimum wage. They taught people how to dress for a job interview, how to look at a prospective employer in the eye, how to shake hands, stuff that you and I would take for granted, but these people had never been taught. They followed this one African-American woman into a job interview, or up to the door. She went in, she applied all of those things she had learned. She came out, and she was in tears, not because she was rejected, but because she got the job. For the first time in her life, she felt she had value. Nobody had told her this before. Well, you're black, you're female, you live in the ghetto, your life is going to be lousy, vote for Democrats. That's the message that so many get. So I'm saying if we can have more inspiration and we have more people telling how they overcame, then I think we're going to inspire an awful lot of people. America's always been a storytelling nation. We don't tell the stories anymore.
But do you think that's a dodge, Cal, from the fact that there's growing inequality in terms of incomes and earnings in our country, that when you look at the realities, the harsh realities, what you see is that the top 1%, famous now from the Occupy movement, but the top 1% has taken in a disproportionate, I mean wildly disproportionate share of increases in wealth in the country over the last 10 years. And the consequence has been a declining middle class, increasing numbers of people in poverty. And when you hold up, exceptional people and say, oh, well, this person did it, so, you can do it too, it's fine, that really runs counter to what we see as the larger structural issues in this society.
Well, President Obama and some of the Democrats have, of course, been talking a lot about income inequality. And I wrote a column a few weeks ago in which I stated that I had a deep, dark secret that I had hidden from public view for many years, and it was very embarrassing for me to go public with it, but I felt it was necessary for me to do so, and I said, I suffer from income inequality. It's true, Juan. There have always been people who made more money than I. You probably make more money than I do, but you know something? It doesn't affect me. The fact that you make $2 and I make $1 doesn't mean you owe me 50 cents. It means I come to you to find out how you made the $2. Income isn't fixed for everybody for life. If there is only one bowl of food at the dinner table and I take more than you, that might be unfair because I might not be satisfying your hunger. But if I give you a recipe, or if I ask the cook to bring in more food so you can make, or the recipe so you can make your own food, that's fair. So the fact that Donald Trump makes more than I do has absolutely nothing to do with my income level. I I used to interview as a young reporter wealthy and successful people. I didn't envy them. I said, where'd you go to school? What'd you study? What's your philosophy of life? I might want to be like you someday. But now the attitude is, if you make more than me, it's not fair, and so I ought to drag you down. But that doesn't build me up. You know, where are the poor people better off because of higher taxes? Are they getting a direct check if Donald Trump or Ted Turner or you or me pays more taxes? No. They're not improving their lives. They're not saying, you know, for 3 years I got this government welfare check, and now I'm CEO of my company. You never hear that.
But I'm saying to you, you have a situation where the question is maximizing opportunity for all. And when you look at the realities of the income distribution charts in the country now, they're swinging wildly out of proportion in terms of who is gaining wealth and opportunity, even in terms of those schools that you scorn. The children that get to go there tend to be the children of the rich. The rich are getting more and more of our money. You look at Wall Street, the big returns are on Wall Street these days. So it sounds as if you're being indifferent to people who are struggling to get themselves out of poverty and onto the ladder of upward mobility.
I used to be poor, Juan. When I was in the Army, I made $99 a month, and I was working in New York City at Armed Forces Radio. We had no car. I was young, married. We took the subway. It was 10 cents. When it went to 15 cents, people screamed and yelled about how the poor are going to be able to afford this. I think it's over $2 now. But I never envied people. I said, I can improve my life. I'm going to be better someday. I'm going to keep working at it. I was 37 years old, making $25,000 a year, and still struggling, taking public transportation to work. We had one car.
But Cal, the way you're talking sounds like you're just celebrating individual virtue.
That's what America's all about, not equal outcomes.
So even when somebody is ripping off the system, causing Wall Street to collapse, you say, ignore that,
no,
let's go back to individual
virtue. I didn't say that. If you go back, if you rewind the tape, Juan, you'll see that I said that I didn't think AIG and some of these others should have been bailed out with taxpayer money. I think they should have been allowed to fail. I think the people responsible for the recession should have paid the biggest price, not the investors and not the employees. If they didn't go to jail, and a lot of them should have that didn't, because they could afford fancy lawyers, they should have been forced to pay back some of the people that they injured. But
if they had no money and they were going to collapse the entire American economic system, if you roll back the tape, I said that to you.
Yes, you did.
But again, I come back to the idea that you don't focus on the idea of what we as an American people can do to try to correct some of the flaws in the way that we live. Instead, your position, and it's the position of the book, is correcting human mistakes is a Rube's game. You're not going to do it.
Juan, government cannot force me to stay married to my wife, to be an example to my children, to have honesty and integrity in my professional life. Those are moral and spiritual issues that come from another place.
Right.
Government can impose certain penalties if I break certain laws, but it can't force me to be moral and virtuous. Not that I am. I'm just saying. So I'm saying what I'm saying. Let me use this analogy. There was a Catholic prelate named Bishop Fulton Sheen years ago who stood up at the 1979 National Prayer Breakfast in Washington and asked a question. How do we define a football field? By its boundaries, he said. Now, we've exceeded our boundaries in every area, morally, relationally, sexually, economically, and we wonder why we have these problems. Huge numbers of incurable now STDs, so many babies born out of wedlock, an enormous abortion rate, including and especially among minority Americans. Over 80% of black babies in New York are aborted. Jesse Jackson used to say this was the white man's answer to the welfare problem.
That's not true, by the way.
What?
What is true is 80% maybe, 80% of the abortions in New York City are among minority children. So that's blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and others. Fine. But you should also know 70% of the population is minority. So it's not as wildly disproportionate as that might sound.
The point is, Juan, that we're cheapening life at all levels. And when you had something like Hillary Care during the Clinton administration, not Obamacare, now, Sarah Palin talked about death panels and was widely ridiculed. But this is what is happening in Britain. If you look to the NHS, there's a chapter in my book.
She was talking about Obamacare.
Yes, but I'm about to make a point here. There's a chapter in my book called Cure versus Care. And this may surprise you. I'm all for government spending more money to find cures. If we could find a cure to Alzheimer's disease, which is a huge affliction of the baby boomers now as they are retiring, you're going to save a whole lot of money from having to treat people with Alzheimer's and so many other diseases. So I'm for investing as much money as possible in finding cures for these things. But you've got, as I started to say about the NHS in Great Britain, you're now seeing people on panels, you can call them whatever you like, denying people care and surgery because it costs too much, or they're too old, or they're not contributing enough to the government coffers. That, I believe, is what is coming here. And the reason it's coming here is because life has been cheapened at one level, the unborn, and now the challenge is going to be at the other level, the elderly, the infirm, the unwanted. It's coming.
Okay, and one of the heroes that you cite in your book is none other than John Calvin Thomas. So your story,
all my names.
Your story is, for you, an example of this virtue. Explain.
Well, I was very fortunate. I had two parents who stayed married. I had a brother who died a year and a half ago. He had Down syndrome. At the time when he was born in 1950, children like that were institutionalized and not expected to live beyond their 20s. My parents said, we're not going to do that, and so he lived to be 60. And that was an example of compassion that I carry with me to this day. But my compassion is not just about giving a hand out, it's about giving a hand up. I'm not going to tell you all the people I work with and the things I've done for people, because that would sound self-serving. But you'd be surprised at a lot of things that I do for people, monetarily, relationally, and other things. But the goal is always to help them improve their lives and to become independent and functioning individuals. Not just to say, you know, oh, there's a guy with a sign on the side of the road, I'll give him a few bucks, tax-free money, so he can go off and do whatever he wants with it. You stop and roll down the window and say, hey, says we'll work for food. They don't say that anymore, by the way. It doesn't say they'll work for food. Too many people stop and say, okay, I got a job. You want to cut my lawn? No. It's easier to get the money than to do the rest. But I do think that we have redefined compassion, Juan. And my story, while I was very fortunate to grow up in a two-parent home, I worked very hard. When I flunked out of college my first year, my father called me in and said, you know, I've been happy to support you all these years, but if you go back, you're going to pay your own way. Was that cruel? No, because when I paid my own way, I got serious and my grades went up because it was my money I was spending. So that's what I'm saying. You know, today's attitude would be, oh, he flunked out of college. Let's send him a check. Let's let him back in anyway with no price to pay. So that taught me a great lesson. And that's why I say failure is a wonderful thing if you learn from it. But if you just accept the idea of victimhood, one of the quotes from Roger Ailes, our boss at Fox News, is he spoke of the Horatio Alger Society a couple of years ago. He said, you know, if you think of yourself as a victim, you'll always be a victim. But if you think of yourself as a success, eventually you will be one. I love that attitude.
Well, but in your story, you talk about having been turned down by many newspapers as you desired to write a column. But then here comes one editor who says at the LA Times, let's give him a chance. Why don't you tell that story?
Well, I first met Tom Johnson when he was a White House fellow in the Lyndon Johnson administration, and I was a copy boy at NBC. Went over to the White House and met him, found him to be a very engaging young man, and hoped that he did the same, find the same in me. Years later, I wrote a column as a lark. I'd written this book in 1983 called Book Burning, about censorship from the left. And so I wrote a column about it, and I sent it off to what I thought would be the least likely newspaper to print it, the New York Times. And they printed it, still framed on my wall as a historical document. And then I wrote another one later on a subject that interested me. The Washington Post printed that, and then another one, the LA Times, USA Today. I said, man, what's going on here? So I contacted all these syndicates. Again, my background was broadcasting, not newspapers. And they all turned me down. So I remember that Tom was publisher of the LA Times at the time, and I called him up. And I said, Tom, I think there's a dearth of good conservative commentary, particularly on the social and cultural issues that get people's attention even more than the economics. He said, well, you may be right. Next time you come out to L.A., let me know, and I'll set you up with a meeting with our syndicate people. They're separate from us. They make their own decisions. So I went out there and I met with them, and they miraculously, I would say, offered me a chance to do 2 columns a week, and in April it'll be 30 years, and at one time, I don't know where it is now, how many papers I have, but it was among, if not the top syndicated columns in America. But I never took no for an answer. I never took rejection as the final word. And there's an old song that Barbara Cook sings, among others, it's not where you start, it's where you finish.
And in fact, you mentioned in What Works that Johnson is a liberal.
Yeah, he's a liberal Democrat, and but he's a real committed to diversity and pluralism. I dedicated the book to him because he opened the door for me. My life changed because of him. He's an honest, wonderful man. I had dinner with him recently in Atlanta, and he and his wife, and they're just great people. And this is what's happened, Juan. I mentioned this in the book too. Nobody knows anybody anymore, in Washington especially. We're all labeled liberal, conservative. Yes, I do it for communication, I know. We're all parts of groups, African American, Latino, women, men, gay, straight, whatever it is. So we're all identified by labels, and nobody gets to know each other. It's like Bob Beckel and I become very, very close personal friends. I know about his family life, his kids, his desires, his frustrations, and all of this, and he knows about mine, because we look beyond the labels. But there's a lot of money and political power in keeping us divided, Juan. Solutions to problems hurts fundraising. I asked a fundraiser years ago in my naivete, hey, how come you never send out a positive letter on what you're doing with people's donations? He says you can't raise money on a positive. Now, how cynical is that? And how divisive is that? So we're no longer the United States of America. We're the divided states of groups. And that's what is really harming us, I think, on many levels.
But this book is, in fact, directed at one of those niche audiences, which is the hard right.
Well, I hope not. Look, I read a lot of liberals. I have many, many liberal friends who are authors and columnists. I pay attention to what they're saying. And in the book, I grant that I say, look, if it's a liberal idea, if it's living up to its established reason for being, its charter, its authorized legislation, I'm for it. If it's doing people good, if it's promoting the general welfare, I'm for it. Again, government is not evil. Government is good if it functions within its boundaries. But we've exceeded those boundaries, and that's why government's become dysfunctional.
But you've got, when I say that the book is part of the niche argument, the fragmented America that you lament, you've got a foreword by Sean Hannity. You quote Limbaugh extensively. Wow. You note that Mark Levin is, the big talk radio. These are people that are cited in the book, and there are no liberal ideas, including Social Security that you say you like, or Medicare. They're not cited here.
Well, look, this is a counter-argument to much of the problem we're facing. If I thought that government was working well, if I thought it was functioning well and promoting the general welfare, if I thought the 10th Amendment was being lived under, that all rights not specifically delegated to the federal government will be reserved for the states and the people, if I believed in all of that, I wouldn't have even written the book. So this is a counter-argument to what the left is saying about government is the solution to all of our problems. If you tune into John Stossel's excellent show on Fox on Saturday night, he's a libertarian. He goes a little further than I would, but he basically deconstructs all of these government programs and mostly the attitude that people turn to government first. It's like a religious cult, Juan, that no matter the proof that the belief is incorrect, physical proof, people continue to believe in it. And I think, government has replaced God. We used to turn to God. Now we turn to government as our God, and we wonder why it's not working.
And you say that liberals are the ones who turn to government, even though Clinton said era of big government.
Yeah, well, he said it, but he said it after the election when he got smeared.
And you hear Obama saying we have to do more in terms of building up family and individual responsibility.
Well, I'm all for that, but talk is cheap,
I see. I'm just saying you don't say that. In other words, the niche audience, it seems, is the conservative, hard right, maybe, as you experience, evangelical audience.
Well, I don't see myself as hard right. Again, we're using labels here.
Okay.
I mean, you want to ask who one of my favorite writers of all time was? It's Frank Rich, who wrote brilliant columns for the New York Times. Did I agree with everything? Of course not. But that doesn't demean his skills and his ability. I still think he's one of my favorite columnists of all time. I like to say I read two things every day, my Bible and the New York Times, so I know what each side is doing with his book. But look, I'm friendly. I've got friends on all sides. But this is a counter-argument. It's like medicine that doesn't taste good. You might not like it, but it's good for you. Read the book. Understand the arguments. Sure, pick it apart if you think I'm wrong, but give me the evidence of why it's wrong. Tell me why 3 Head Start programs aren't producing what they should. Tell me why there are over 40 different literacy programs in the federal government that overlap or counter one another. Why do we have that? Why is there so much duplication in federal government of programs, especially when none of them seem to be working and producing their desired results? That's why I want another Grace Commission or a BRAC Commission to go through top to bottom. I don't care if it's a liberal or conservative idea. One of the things I mentioned, I don't think it's in the book, but I'm mentioning now on the lecture circuit and on this, is let's take the abstinence education. This was big for the evangelical right. We're going to teach kids that they ought to be virgins till they get married. Well, that's a very, very noble goal. However, the program isn't working. So if it's not working, get rid of it. And that's a conservative evangelical program.
Well, as I say, that's not in the book.
I couldn't put everything in there.
Okay, no, but I'm saying the finger is pointed at the liberals.
Well,
yeah.
Look, they've been in charge of government. They're the party of government,
right.
And they've been at it a lot longer. Conservatives want to put government back within its boundaries. It's like a river. In its boundaries, it's wonderful for sailing, for fishing, for swimming, whatever. But when there's a flood, it destroys property and sometimes lives.
Now, Cal, when we think about solutions and looking back to traditions and traditional America and looking to God in the evangelical sense of God as directing us all in every moment, almost predestination, if you will, the question then becomes, how does Cal Thomas think about the rising number of minorities in America, or now we see more and more Muslims in America? In the book, it doesn't seem like you have a very welcoming attitude towards the Muslim community.
Well, look, this is a nation that began on the issue of religious freedom. Those who came from England did not want a state church, and I certainly don't want one. I don't want the government telling me how to worship, what to worship, or if to worship. So I'm all for that. But I do think that if you're going to be part of America, and if you come from another country, and even a different religious background, then you have to be part of that pluralism. You can make your case in the public square for your belief system, but I don't think you can impose all of it through government, and that includes my point of view, my worldview, the Christian worldview, on everybody who doesn't agree with it. I think these things are won out in the marketplace. They certainly were in civil rights. When Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, others who I was fortunate enough to be a contemporary of, I went to the I Have a Dream speech. I was a copy boy at NBC. It changed my thinking on a lot of things regarding race, because I didn't really know any African-American people other than the maids that my parents employed until I started playing basketball. Oh, I knew about them, but I didn't know anyone as a fellow human being. So I think, I'm all for Muslims in this country, Jews, Christians, unbelievers, and the rest. But I do think that there's a great fear, particularly among radical Islam, that there are certain people who want to infiltrate us and undermine us. And I think we saw that 9/11. These guys came in. They took the training in Florida and other places on how to fly airplanes. They weren't discriminated against. They were given the same lessons that anybody else would be given. So I think we have to be careful. And clearly the radical Islamists come out of a background taught by their imams that their God wants people who don't believe as they do dead. I'm all for people having complete freedom who don't agree with my religious or political worldview. But I've found increasingly that a lot of the extremists within that religion don't, and they have a responsibility to speak up and isolate those people who feel that way.
Well, in fact, what comes through in the book, though, is this kind of, discouraged view about what Islam, especially Muslims in America, are up to. And so the question is, how would you deal with this?
Well, I think the government has a primary responsibility, and from what we know, they are dealing with some of it. They're monitoring some of the more radical mosques. I mean, Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister of England, tried to deport those who were preaching hate from some of the mosques, and not just hate, but insurrection, who wanted to bring down the British government and felt that their God commanded them to do so. Now, he tried to deport them, especially those who were connected with some of the extremists who went out and killed people. You had the subway bombing in Britain, the 7/7, but he was constrained by their version of the ACLU, and I think it came to the point where he was unable to deport any of them. I think we got a serious problem here. We want everybody to come to America under the law in an orderly fashion, but we used to have people, the Irish, the Poles, the Germans, others, who came and assimilated. They wanted their children to learn English. They loved America. They loved our history. They wanted them to learn it. Now we're all hyphenated Americans. One of my favorite lines from Whoopi Goldberg, maybe the only line that I really like she ever said. She said, "I'm not an African American. I'm an American." Yes, she gets it. That's exactly right. But we're all hyphenated now. We're all parts of subgroups. And I think that's the kind of thing that is harming our country.
Well, when it comes to the civil rights movement, and you touch on it briefly in terms of the distinction between Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy versus Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, the different reverends of the different eras. But you acknowledge that, you know what, if you go back to the founders who embraced slavery in the Constitution, if you look at most of the history of the country where legal segregation was the law, you say, well, that's wrong, but change was needed. But in most other areas, you don't embrace change and you don't embrace the idea of us working as a community to improve the quality of all of our lives and our nation.
Let me just touch on one thing you said about the founders. Not all of them owned slaves, and not all of them were for slavery. But like Mr. Lincoln said 100 years later, almost 100 years later, if it required preserving slavery in order to save the Union, he was in favor of preserving slavery. If emancipation would preserve the Union, he would be for emancipation. And the founders, as you know from studying history, Juan, were at a moment, and this wasn't the only issue. There was the power of the states and how much
I understand
Federalists
that,
versus the rest.
But my point to you is they signed the document.
Well, but
I'm just saying.
But look, Dr. King referred, and so did Lincoln, referred back to those founding documents, particularly that greatest phrase ever written about human freedom. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. They understood that rights, in order to be protected from government, had to be put outside the reach of government. And Dr. King appealed to that, and Lincoln appealed to that, and they were absolutely right.
Right, but I'm not discussing that. What I'm talking about is in this book, in terms of trying to say there are common sense solutions that predate all of these arguments.
Yes, of course.
Well, geez, so does slavery.
Yeah, but
and
look,
so does oppression of women.
Right. Well, look, we can go on for an hour about that, but slavery, denial of civil rights are moral issues primarily. Yes, Lyndon Johnson, to his everlasting credit, through voting rights and open housing, helped force that particular part of the country, and not just the South. I mean, you had South Boston and you had riots, race riots there too, so it wasn't just a Southern thing, into an attitude, and with the pictures on television. And I was working during that period for NBC, and I was with reporters, including a guy named Charles Quinn, who went down with the Freedom Riders in Mississippi, came back, told stories, put film on the air that helped sear the conscience of the American people that this was not just wrong legally, this was wrong morally, that black people were entitled to the same rights for lunch counters, restrooms, jobs, housing, whatever it is, not because the government was going to give it to them or should, but because they enjoyed the same endowed and alienable rights as every other human being who's walking.
But Cal, you understand, government had to enforce treatment.
That's true.
Not enforce segregation. So government was an important instrument there.
It was. And again, I'm not saying, Juan, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is a reason for government. Government needs to restrain what the theologians call sinful people who will not be constrained from within by a higher power. That is the purpose of government. Government is a biblically established institution, but it has its limitations. The founders wanted government to be restrained and within boundaries so that the people would be unlimited. That's why the preamble starts, "We the people," not "you the government."
Cal Thomas, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you,
Cal's
Juan.
new book is called What Works? Common Sense Solutions for a Stronger America. And you'll notice on the cover, Cal has a groundhog over his left shoulder. That's because he thinks we keep ignoring the common sense solutions that our forefathers have given.
Repeating the same thing every day like the movie Groundhog Day. That's exactly right.
Cal Thomas, thanks so much for joining us on Afterwards.